Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of nature's oldest, most terrifying biological threats, rabies. Now, you hear that word, and your mind probably jumps right to wild movies and folklore, right? But the actual scientific reality of how this virus operates, it's honestly way more fascinating and, well, chilling than any fiction. Just look at this number, 99.9%. That is the near uniform fatality rate of rabies once clinical symptoms actually appear. There are very, very few pathogens on planet Earth with a mortality rate quite that high. It really sets the life or death stakes for what we're talking about today. With rabies, you're literally racing against a ticking clock. And understanding exactly how that clock works, that's your absolute best defense. So let's get into Section 1, fact versus fiction when it comes to rabies myths. Before we even touch the biology, we really need to shatter a few Hollywood myths. Pop culture has basically trained us to panic over every single mouse or squirrel that crosses our path. But here's the truth. Rodents and lagomorphs, things like rabbits, they rarely carry rabies, and they're almost never known to transmit it to humans. Instead, a staggering 99% of global human cases actually stem from domestic dog bites. Meanwhile, over in the Americas, bats are the primary culprit. So you don't need to freak out over a chipmunk scratch, but you absolutely must respect the risk from dogs and specific wildlife like bats, raccoons, and skunks. 59,000. That is the estimated number of human deaths caused by this virus every single year. And what makes that figure just totally tragic is that rabies is a 100% preventable disease. Yet it continues to disproportionately hit poor and rural populations. In fact, the vast majority of these deaths happen to children under 15 in Asia and Africa. Moving on to Section 2, the stealth invasion. So how does this unseen enemy actually get past the body's defenses? Well, rabies is caused by a lyssavirus, which is this bullet-shaped RNA virus. It transmits when infected saliva hits open skin or mucous membranes, so almost always through a bite. The absolutely crucial point to remember here is that rabies is neurotropic. What does that mean for us? It means the virus is highly specialized. It entirely skips the bloodstream where your immune system is heavily patrolling and specifically targets and hijacks your nervous system instead. This stealthy invasion essentially happens in 3 steps. First, the virus literally pinches the cellular membrane to slip inside local muscle cells near the bite. This is a process called pinocytosis. Step 2, it just hangs out there. It replicates completely unnoticed by your immune system, quietly building its army. Then, step 3. It binds to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors right at the neuromuscular junction. It essentially picks the lock to your nerve endings. Which brings us to Section 3, hijacking the nervous system. Once it's bound, the virus doesn't just, float its way up to the brain. No, it actively hijacks the nerve cell's own internal transport machinery. It uses these things called dynin proteins to propel itself, a process called retrograde axoplasmic flow. So it's literally using your body's own neural highway system, traveling straight up the spinal cord at a really steady, unstoppable pace. Now, because the virus physically has to travel along those nerves, the incubation period, that ticking clock we mentioned, is super variable. Think about it. If you get bit on the foot, the virus has a long way to go, so the average incubation is 20 to 90 days. We've even seen cases that took years. But if the bite is near your central nervous system, like on the head or neck, the virus has a major shortcut. The incubation can be just days, and that timeline completely dictates your window to act. Section 4, the point of no return. We have to ask, what actually happens when clinical symptoms finally show up? Well, this marks the exact moment the virus hits the brain. Up to this point, it's been totally stealthy. But once it's in the brain, viral replication just explodes exponentially. Your glial cells fail to produce protective interferon, and suddenly, the virus has complete control of your central nervous system. From there, the clinical progression is chilling. It kicks off with a prodromal phase, maybe a fever or some tingling or pain right where you were bitten. Next, about 80% of cases develop furious rabies. This means severe agitation, hyperactivity, and that infamous symptom, hydrophobia. Hydrophobia is a series of severe muscle spasms in the throat, triggered just by the thought, sight, or sound of water. The other 20% of cases develop paralytic rabies, which is a slow, progressive paralysis. Finally, the virus spreads centrifugally outward from the brain into the salivary glands. It heavily loads the host's saliva, making absolutely sure it can infect the next victim before the host passes away. Now, you might have actually heard stories about people surviving rabies, usually having to do with something called the Milwaukee Protocol. But we have to be clear and authoritative here. This experimental coma induction therapy is now widely considered a failed approach. Despite a few really rare, highly publicized survival anomalies in the past, modern medical consensus firmly states there is no reliable cure once symptoms begin. All right, Section 5, the race against time. If you are exposed, you have to immediately start the post-exposure prophylaxis protocol, or PEP. Step 1 is actually something you can do yourself. Wash the wound thoroughly with soap and water for a full 15 minutes. It sounds too simple to work, right? But animal studies show this physically destroys the viral envelope and washes away particles, cutting the risk of rabies by up to 30%. Step 2 is getting to a hospital to have the wound infiltrated with rabies immune globulin, which gives you immediate passive antibodies. And step 3 is finishing a multi-dose vaccine series to train your own body to hunt the virus down before it ever reaches the central nervous system. But what if you're in an area where hospitals aren't exactly right around the corner? For folks in high-risk zones, there's pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP. Getting a vaccine series before a bite ever happens primes your immune system for a super-fast memory response. If you're exposed later on, you need fewer post-exposure doses, and crucially, you completely eliminate the need for that expensive and hard-to-find rabies immune globulin. It's a proactive defense that makes emergency treatment way easier, and it's been a total game changer for mass campaigns in remote parts of Peru and the Philippines. And finally, Section 6, Strategies for Global Prevention. Preventing rabies isn't a one-size-fits-all thing. The primary vectors change radically depending on your environment. Globally, especially in Asia and Africa, 99% of cases come from unvaccinated dogs. But in the US, domestic rabies is basically eliminated, so the threat shifts to wildlife like bats and raccoons. Head down to the Amazon basin in Peru, and rural populations face up to an 88% lifetime risk of getting bitten by vampire bats. So obviously you can't rely on a suburban prevention strategy if you're in the Amazon rainforest or a rural village in the Philippines. So what's the ultimate solution? It's the One Health approach. This is the idea that human health is totally intertwined with animal health and our shared environment. We can't just protect humanity inside emergency rooms with post-exposure shots. We have to actively manage our ecosystems and, more than anything, run mass vaccination campaigns for domestic dogs. If you stop the virus in the animal reservoir, you effectively wipe out the threat to humans. Rabies is this terrifying, microscopic stealth invader that quite literally travels our own nerve pathways. But here's the thing you should take away from all this. It is 100% preventable. We already have the vaccines, the medical protocols, and the veterinary science. With all these incredible tools at our disposal, how long until the world finally unites to eradicate this ancient killer once and for all? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.